going to have another catastrophe sooner than later. It'll be bigger than 2008, but the next one's going to be strike three. We've had 2 warnings. They've been ignored. The third time, it's game over.
¿Os imagináis que hubiese hiperinflación en el futuro en Estados Unidos y en Europa? Realmente parece imposible, improbable, pero lo cierto es que no podemos ignorar lo que ha pasado en los últimos 15 años. Una impresión monetaria como nunca hemos visto antes, y por eso en este vídeo quiero que prestéis atención a lo que dice uno de los expertos que yo más seguía cuando empecé a interesarme mucho por la historia económica y la historia monetaria, que es Mike Maloney, y quiero que veáis cómo explica él y cómo predijo lo que iba a ocurrir y ha acertado, y lo que él cree que va a ocurrir en el futuro. Además, quiero que veáis también por qué es tan importante entender el concepto de la velocidad monetaria, porque es la clave para que exista hiperinflación en el futuro, y hay que entender muy bien cómo se crea la inflación, porque hay gente que cree que es solo una cuestión de imprimir dinero y esto es solo una variable. Y además también vamos a ver cómo todas estas políticas han hecho mega ricos al top 1% de la población y cómo ha creado una grandísima desigualdad en todo el mundo. Para empezar vamos a ver qué ocurrió en Alemania, por qué hubo hiperinflación en Alemania en la Primera Guerra Mundial, y es importante que prestéis atención a los detalles a cada momento para que entendáis qué ocurrió en cada parte del ciclo y por qué es importante entender esto por si ocurre en el futuro y puedes determinar dónde exactamente estamos en esa parte del proceso.
At the beginning of World War I, Germany went off the gold standard and suspended the right of its citizens to redeem their currency, the mark, for gold and silver. Like all wars, World War I was a war of and by the printing press. The number of marks in circulation in Germany quadrupled during the war. Prices, however, had not kept up with the inflation of the currency supply, so the effects of this inflation were not felt. The reason for this peculiar phenomenon was because in times of uncertainty, people tend to save every penny, and World War I was definitely a time of uncertainty. So even though the German government was pumping tons of currency into the system, no one was spending it, yet. But by war's end, confidence flooded back along with the currency that had been on the sidelines, and the ravaging effects worked their way through the country as prices rose to catch up with the previous monetary inflation. Just before the end of the war, the exchange rate between gold and the mark was about 100 marks per ounce. But by 1920, it was fluctuating between 1,000 and 2,000 marks per ounce. Retail prices shortly followed suit, rising by 10 to 20 times. Anyone who still had the savings they had accumulated during the war was bewildered when they found it could only buy 10% or less of what it could just a year or two earlier. Then, all through the rest of 1920 and the first half of 1921, inflation slowed, and on the surface the future was beginning to look a little brighter. The economy was recovering, business and industrial production was up, but now there were war reparations to pay, so the government never stopped printing currency. In the summer of 1921, prices started rising again, and by July of 1922, prices had risen another 700%. This was the breaking point, and what broke was people's confidence in their economy and their currency. Having watched the purchasing power of their savings fall by 90% in 1919, they knew better this time around. They were smarter. They had been here before. Suddenly, everybody started to spend their currency as soon as they got it.
La velocidad monetaria es un concepto que probablemente mucha gente no conozca. Estos son conceptos que se suelen explicar súper complejos, pero creo que los fundamentos, lo más básico, no es tan difícil de entender. Como veis en pantalla actualmente, tenemos una fórmula que es M por V igual a P por Q, donde la M es la oferta monetaria o money supply en inglés, la V es la velocidad del dinero en circulación, que son las transacciones que realiza una misma unidad monetaria, un dólar o un euro, luego la P es el precio y la Q es la cantidad. P por Q, si multiplicamos esto, es el PIB de un país, es decir, el precio por la cantidad de bienes y servicios nos da el PIB de un país. Y vemos que la M y la V obviamente van a influir en el precio si la cantidad se mantiene constante. ¿Qué ha ocurrido en los últimos años? Que se ha impreso mucho dinero, es decir, la M ha subido mucho, pero no hemos tenido inflación al instante. Y la razón es que la V ha compensado a la baja, ha absorbido todo ese dinero y ha hecho que no veamos una inflación como mucha gente podía esperar de forma instantánea. Lo que ha ocurrido en los últimos meses es que la velocidad no ha compensado ya todo ese exceso de dinero y el problema sería que la velocidad monetaria se incrementase en el futuro. Cuanto más rápido se mueve el dinero que hay en circulación y se usa más veces, es cuando realmente tenemos inflación. Y por eso es muy importante que entendamos estos términos para saber por qué la inflación en un principio no ha subido tanto como mucha gente esperaba en los primeros años de impresión monetaria y también porque es un gran riesgo de cara al futuro si, como vemos, la V empieza a cambiar.
And their currency supply is $1. That's the only dollar that exists. And it circulates once, and so you've got $1 times a velocity of 1 equals a GDP, the size of the economy is $1. If it circulates twice, it's 2. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We've given each one of these people $1. If they all make a transaction, there has now been 10 transactions, but each dollar was only involved in one of them. So it's a currency supply of $10 times one transaction each equals a $10 GDP. So even though you've got 10 times the currency supply, the economy has the same vibrance. Then we have a second transaction, a third, a fourth. This could be a healthy economy. It could also be an economy running into hyperinflation. Keynesians, that's the type of economists that are running the modern day economy, believe that you can create a healthy economy by changing this figure here, the size of the currency supply. So the Federal Reserve thinks that by adding currency to the economy that they're going to be able to stimulate it and make the economy grow. And the thing is, it isn't the quantity of currency, it's the amount of goods and services that are created in that country that determines the country's level of prosperity. So if you just add a bunch of currency, all it's going to do eventually is drive up prices. Velocity will slow at first, and that's what we're seeing now. Same thing happened in Weimar, Germany. Now, this is the US currency supply from 1918 until today. And we've created all of this currency, but we haven't seen any ravaging inflation yet. And that is because velocity has fallen to compensate for the creation of currency. But there will come a time when the psychology of the country changes, and you will see, after this short-term deflation, where velocity falls even further, you will then see the velocity pick up and prices will rise. And I believe that we will go into a hyperinflation because they're going to create more currency than this. And that currency is going to be sitting there, and velocity will have slowed and slowed and slowed to compensate it until something changes psychologically.
¿Os acordáis cuando hemos hablado de la oferta monetaria y cómo la velocidad había compensado ese incremento de la oferta monetaria? Pues aquí veis en una gráfica básicamente lo que ha ocurrido. En esta gráfica veis cómo en la línea azul, que es la oferta monetaria dividido el PIB, es decir, cuántas unidades de divisa persiguen los bienes y servicios, no ha hecho más que incrementarse desde el año 2000 y ha alcanzado récords históricos con un ratio actual de 2. Que es casi el doble de lo que veíamos hace 20 años. ¿Por qué no ha habido una superinflación alta de bienes y servicios en estos años? Pues porque, como veis, la línea roja, la velocidad del dinero ha ido cayendo y se ha desplomado recientemente, además, tras la pandemia. Es importante, como vemos, la velocidad monetaria ha frenado su desplome y hemos visto una pequeña subida hacia arriba. Tras este desplome ha habido un mini repunte, no sé si lo observáis, que ha hecho que veamos inflación. Por eso es muy importante y mucha gente cree que la inflación en el futuro está garantizada. Lo que nadie sabe es cuándo va a ocurrir, igual que mucha gente predecía la inflación hace unos años, pero no sabía cuándo iba a ocurrir ese cambio psicológico o ese detonante que hiciera que todo cambiara. Todo ha cambiado ahora y ahora mismo no se sabe cómo van a poder controlar la inflación los gobiernos y sobre todo con la cantidad de dinero que hay en el sistema, es muy probable que en el futuro se desencadenen otros episodios inflacionarios.
There's a name for that. It's called money illusion, which is before the inflation really kicks in and either gets extreme or turns into hyperinflation. There is this feel-good period where, you know, there's more money around and, you know, unemployment's dropping and people feel more prosperous. The prices haven't quite skyrocketed yet. It's all illusory because it'll go away once the price level adjusts. A lot of people assume that inflation is a function of money supply or money printing, and that's not right. It's a partial function of money supply, but the other part of the function is behavioral. It has to do with velocity, which is just a psychological phenomena. You know, do you feel good? Do you want to go out for dinner? Do you want to take your friends? You know, do you want to take a vacation, or do you want to stay home, leave your money in the bank, and watch TV? Those are two different states of the world, based a lot on your confidence and how you feel. Both things have to come together to get the kind of inflation the Fed wants. Now here's the problem. They can make the money supply whatever they want. They're certainly printing trillions of dollars, we understand that. So far, they have not been able to bend the velocity curve. They have not been able to get you and me and everyone else in America and around the world to spend more money. But let's say they do. They change the psychology, they change the behavior. Once you change it, it's very hard to change it back. It's not like throwing an on-off switch. I mean, it's taken years for the Fed to, you know, kind of try to inject an inflation scare, try to get some inflation. But what if it actually comes? What if inflation goes from 1% to 3% in a matter of 6 months and stays there and looks like it's going to 3.5%? Well, the next stop is 10%. It's not, the Fed thinks they can dial it back down to 2.5%, which is what they say they want. But what they'll find is once that velocity, once that behavioral genie is out of the bottle, they won't be able to get it back in. It'll take off, it'll take on a life of its own. What's the Fed going to do? You know, raise interest rates to 10% with unemployment at 7%? I mean, people go down and burn down the Fed. I mean, there are limits on what they can do. But the point is, once it starts, and you're exactly right, it's a feedback loop. If the Fed thinks they can control it, they're wrong. They say we'll be on our way to 10%, if not worse.
Certainly a situation where society owes more than it can pay, and where it has to default, either honestly or dishonestly, that will initially have deflationary outcomes. But I suspect, like you, be for the big thinkers to solve that problem and solve it in the only way they know how, which is to fill every crack, even the Grand Canyon, with currency.
Ahora quiero que veáis cómo Mike Maloney cree que acabará toda esta historia.
As the shadow of millions of stealth currency bombers darken the skies, currency will begin to fall like rain in the desert. Tax rebate checks in the mail. Fear will be temporarily alleviated, and some of that currency will come out of hiding, just as in Weimar Germany. Prices will rise quickly and dramatically as all that stored up currency energy is released. In a panic, the Fed will call back the bombers, but it will be too late. There's nothing they will be able to do to stop it now because the hyperinflation will have already begun. But the stored up energy of excess currency creation doesn't have to take place within the United States, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in the future. In fact, there is an abundance of stored up currency just waiting to be released right now. All the dollars we sent overseas to other countries to buy their goods and services are now sitting in their bank accounts, just waiting to be spent. Eventually, the world economy will lose faith in the US dollar and will want to dump it by buying up goods. And as all those dollars come flooding back into the US, it will, of course, cause the prices of those goods and services to rise, and could, and probably will, trigger a scenario much like the one I have just finished describing.
Ahora quiero que prestéis atención a esta gráfica que muestra una línea verde y una línea azul. La línea verde es la cantidad de dinero que el top 1% de Estados Unidos tiene en el banco aparcado, y la línea azul, en cambio, muestra el dinero acumulado que tiene la parte baja, el 50% más bajo de la población en Estados Unidos. Os llamará la atención cómo entre 1990 y 2007, antes de la crisis, antes de que empezaran a imprimir dinero como un loco, la distribución de riqueza era similar entre estos dos grupos. Pero a partir de 2011, cuando empezaron a imprimir como unos locos y empezamos a ver inflación en activos, vemos cómo mucha gente, los que más tenían, se beneficiaron en mayor medida que el resto de la población, pero nada comparado a lo que ocurrió después de la pandemia, para que observéis la magnitud del cambio que existió después de la pandemia. Los más ricos, los súper ricos, se beneficiaron y ahora tienen en el banco hasta 100 veces más del dinero que tenían anteriormente. Obviamente también se beneficiaron los que menos tenían, pero no en la misma medida. Algo importante que tenéis que tener en cuenta es que esto significa una cosa. Esto significa que cuando las cosas se calmen o las burbujas se desinflen, volverán a inflarse. ¿Por qué? Porque hay demasiado dinero en el sistema y por eso es probable que, aunque veamos respiros en la inflación en el corto plazo o en el medio plazo, la inflación probablemente vuelva a desatarse en el futuro. Hay demasiado dinero en el sistema y todo dependerá de la velocidad monetaria, como hemos visto ya previamente.